Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, August 8th, 2022, and today we are going to be talking about the state of Washington with Senator Patty Murray, the Democrat who has been serving in this Senate seat since the 1990s. A Democratic senator who is honestly speaking quite popular that Republicans seem to more recently target in this state, believe that Washington might join the list of competitive states on the national level for the Republican Party to have potential pickup opportunities. Now, 2022 is expected in a large regard to be a red wave year, but specifically in the state of Washington, Republicans are hoping that a return to a competitive Senate race, the likes of which that they saw back in the 2010 Senate elections, that would make the state competitive for this election cycle, reallocate Democratic resources in a state that they never predicted would be competitive, and would allow this race to return to its 2010 roots of a Democrat and a Republican in a single-digit race. Now, believe it or not, the incumbent that has been here, as I said, has been serving through the 90s, but almost lost in 2010. That was in a Senate bid against a former governor candidate, Dino Rossi, or Rossi if that's how you pronounce it, ran for governor in 2004 narrowly, and I mean narrowly lost. We can take a look at this margin. 2004 came down 48.873 to 48.868, a margin of 100 votes over, 3 million cast across the state, or nearly 3 million cast across the state. So to see this as the result, you know that this candidate went into it with high name recognition, ran again in 2008. Obama won the state by 17 points plus. What happens here, the Democrat in the same election only wins by about 5 points across the state. So when they return to run in 2010, in a much better year for the GOP, they narrow it down. Patty Murray, who had again served in the U.S. Senate for decades leading into this, is now in a competitive position where she won by less than 5 points. So this less than 5-point margin, I think, really put the state of Washington on the radar for the GOP. In 2016, it certainly was not competitive, but when you looked at the election now, some Republicans might argue that it will be competitive, that it will return again to what we saw in 2010. Now, seeing that the Republican Party has again, and I'm sorry for saying again multiple times, has put forth ads within two blue states, Washington being one of them. One of the states that they want to target is the state of Colorado, which I think is reasonable, at least historically speaking. Colorado has typically had close and competitive states, and Biden's victory was very large, but that doesn't mean it is 1,000% out of play. The state of Washington, following these primary results, I think, show that it is entirely 1,000% out of play for the Washington GOP, for the national GOP. The reason why they are trying to cling on to the state of Washington is because the remaining competitive states are just the standard competitive states, and there's only about 4 of them that Democrats realistically could potentially lose: Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and New Hampshire. Colorado is pushing it, but even then, that is at most 5. In 2020, Republicans had numerous targets against Democrats. In 2018, they had 10 states that Donald Trump won in 2016 with Democratic incumbents that they were heavily targeting. So the state of Washington seems to be a last-ditch effort to force Democrats to try to reallocate their resources, narrow up the race, and as a result, Democrats are going to lose ground in Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, and New Hampshire at the expense of going on defense in such a blue state. But Tuesday's primary results indicated that Tiffany Smiley, the Republican frontrunner, is not in the best position to run for Senate. The results here show that in a non-competitive Democratic jungle primary, I mean, this is something that, Democrats, Republicans altogether vote in, but in a non-competitive primary, Patty Murray ends up in a position with 53% of the vote. Meaning that those who are willing to vote in this primary, and what is expected to be already a low turnout year for the Democratic Party based off of those voting in this primary. This wasn't like Kansas. They didn't have some type of major proposition on the ballot. There was no reason to turn out to vote in this extent. But what happened is, of the results that we have thus far, what do you find? Patty Murray gets 53% of the vote to Tiffany Smiley's 33%. It's a 20-point margin, and if you combine the Democratic Party's vote share over the GOP, you find that it's 56 to 41. Now, it does show that the results are narrower than where it was during the 2020 presidential election. It's a 15-point margin versus what was a 19-point margin in the presidential election, indicating that our national environment is slightly better for the Republican Party. But it does certainly not indicate that the race is going to be competitive. This jungle primary is not at all an indicator that there is going to be a good year for the GOP in Washington, and not at all an indicator whatsoever that Washington would go red. Looking at the 2010 Senate race, what we find in the top two primary election in 2010, you found that the results for the Republican, Dino Rossi, is roughly the same. But what you take a look at here is that Patty Murray, as the Democratic candidate, only received 46% of the vote. 46% is so important because when you take a look at the historical elections, 2006, for instance, 2004, for instance, Patty Murray won her election there by 12 points. You go back to the year 1998, Patty Murray won by 17 points. You take a look back at previous elections, and what do you find? I don't think this state was beyond the 90s. Patty Murray won by 8 points in 1992. And you go beyond 2010, and what do you find? That in 2016, she was able to win, despite President Trump winning on the national level, by 18 points. So in a 2010 environment, a very good year for the GOP, it was a 4.7-point margin, and it was largely indicated by this top two primary result. The fact that Patty Murray could not even get an outright majority was very, very telling. Very telling. When you combine the Democratic Party's vote share, you have 46.22 plus 0.79, 0.78. Thinking about this, plus 0.42, plus 0.33, you end up with about 48.54% of the vote. When you look at the Republicans, on the other hand, 48.5% of the vote, you already have a significant chunk. Because with the top two contenders together, you end up already at 46%. You add the other contender, you're at 48.66, and then you add the remaining bunch, and you end up in a position where the combined vote share in the general primary is higher for Republicans than Democrats. But with Patty Murray alone, what do you find? The primary results show that Democrats win a combined vote share of 56%. This is not 2010. This is not a competitive race, and the NRSC is using their money unwisely by allocating resources to such a safe state. This primary was the perfect indicator, a very big one to Democrats and Republicans in Washington and across the country, that this is not the state that they want to heavily target. In addition to that, some of these House election results aren't going in the way that you might like if you are a Republican. Some of these results show some incumbents losing in some more competitive races. Some of these races show that the results simply aren't fully tabulated, and some are being thrown out or barely won their race despite being incumbents as well. But the Washington Senate primary, completely different. This Democrat, as the incumbent, defeated the next top candidate by 20 points and got a combined vote share of 53.1%, or a total vote share for that one candidate, and then the remaining Democrats added about 3 points. I think what we can expect November is very similar to what we see on the 538 forecast, that we can expect a margin to come out again of about 12, 13, 14, potentially even 15, 16 points, as we already have seen indicated by the jungle primary. And typically speaking, and I say this looking at the past results, typically speaking, the combined vote share in the jungle primary is worse for Democrats in the regular election. So, or let me rephrase that the combined vote share in some of these races, more specifically in the House, I would say, that Democrats typically see an underperformance from some of these polls or from some of these early numbers within the jungle primary versus what is actually done on Election Day. So to know that, seeing that Patty Murray still has such a significant lead, it means that we should not even talk about this race at all. I think for a very brief period of time, I bought into the notion that Washington can be described as anything but safe Democrat. Many forecasts also still seem to think that Washington is somewhat in play. Politico's forecast has the state of Washington as a likely Democratic seat, but to be quite honest with you, when you take a look at the other likely Democratic seats, Washington, Colorado, and Vermont, what jumps out there? Washington and Vermont. Vermont is one of the most Democratic states in the entire country, and it will be a very safe margin for Peter Welch, the incumbent House of Representatives member within the state. So to see the state of Washington be joining the bunch of Vermont and Colorado, I think it's very similar to to Vermont in the sense that it shouldn't even be here in the first place. It's not likely Democrat, it's safe Democrat, and that is the way it should be treated, and this primary only further indicated that that belief is true. As I said, for a brief period of time, I did believe that Washington might become more competitive. It ended up around the time of being, late April, early May, and then I sort of came to my senses and realized there's nothing further indicating that the race in the general election is going to be more competitive besides a few out there polls. And while I do think that the polls themselves were good indicators for the state of the race at the time, I think the Democratic Party's chances at victory in the Senate have gone up. I think that in many red states and blue states, you've started to see abortion become a more polarizing issue, and in almost every single case, benefiting Democrats. And I think also on top of that, these primary results only further my belief that Washington is an untouchable state for the GOP to even, or for the Democrats, an untouchable state that they are going to hold on to practically no matter what happens on the national level. To reiterate, this is not 2010. This is not a state that can be easily swung. And I think looking at the GOP candidate, some Republicans are hopeful, which is why the NRSC is wasting their money in the state of Washington. But in terms of what they are doing versus what is reality, you're finding a very big difference. Realistically speaking, they should not be touching this race with a 6-foot pole if they did social distance, right? You would not want them to even come close to this race, much less spend money on this race. I think by November, you will see the GOP have a complete and total withdrawal from this race, because any hope that Washington Senate race is competitive is completely wish casting. It's completely illogical at this point, especially looking at some of these results. Patty Murray proved that in a year that is supposed to be similar to 2010 and 2014, she was able to win an outright majority in a non-competitive jungle primary as the incumbent Democrat, where years prior to this, she wasn't able to do so. Voters clearly prefer her over any other candidate that is in the race. Even if they might have voted for a Republican in years past, it is evident in this primary and in a lot of other things that we are seeing that these futile efforts by the GOP to narrow down Washington are just that, futile, not going to do anything, completely resistant to what we have seen in terms of interference and a push from the national GOP to narrow up the race. Washington is out of the league for the GOP, and I think the closer we come to realize that, the closer the Republicans come to realize that, the better their chances are in the U.S. Senate. So looking at our map here, I think the states that we really need to focus on moving on forward and the GOP needs to go ahead and, stop focusing on, I sort of get Colorado, but I think at this point it's starting to become a lost cause. I could see the GOP winning it in November if some things get very bad for the Democratic Party on the national level, but it hasn't been getting too much worse. Gas prices are going down. Inflation isn't as bad as it was. On top of that, Biden's approval rating is slightly doing better. On top of that, you also have this passage of bills from the U.S. Senate. You have progress coming out of the White House. A lot of things seem to be moving on the up and up for the Democratic Party, including the national generic ballot, and also the capitalization on the Dobbs ruling is something that the Democratic Party has seemingly done very effectively, despite, in many other instances, dropping the ball on some very important races. Colorado, I wouldn't bet on. Washington, I wouldn't even give a cent of my time, in a literal thought for how the GOP can actually win the state of Washington. Because as it stands right now, it is a very, very low chance. 3% at best. I think FiveThirtyEight is overestimating with that 3%. These primary results are very good indicators about public sentiment and where people are. We saw it in 2010. We've seen it in numerous elections in the state of Washington. And in this one, it's everything that indicates it's a solid Democratic race, including that primary, which was supposed to be a very good showing for the GOP that ended up falling flat on its face. So as I said, the GOP no longer needs to be spending money within this race. I don't know if they will listen. I think that it's completely just a waste of money, but the GOP has wasted money on some other races. But I mean, think about how close Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, and the state of Pennsylvania are. New Hampshire is, North Carolina, Wisconsin. There are other priorities and ones that I think should be more important to the national GOP. And I get it. They have a lot of money and they can choose to spend it how they like. But I think they will be very upset if they lose Georgia by 0.2 the way that Donald Trump did, and think, had we not spent our money on some of these other non-competitive and unwinnable races, would we have been able to win Georgia? Would we have been able to win Pennsylvania? Would we have been able to win Arizona? And if they think yes, then they start to realize why these decisions simply are not politically smart and are completely out of the question in terms of any possibility that states like Washington are going to be competitive. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today. Sorry, tomorrow.